Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Burrhus Frederick Skinner, the architect of behavioral science. Together and apart, they mapped opposing territories of the human experience, one turning inward towards symbol and myth, the other focusing outward on action and consequence. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of human nature. One seeing an inner world teeming with archetypal forces and mythic narratives, the other discovering patterns of reinforcement that shape behavior from without. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Skinner as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the opening decades of the 20th century, when Jung was emerging from his collaboration and subsequent painful break with Sigmund Freud, the landscape of psychology remained young, unsettled, a field of competing visions about what it meant to study the human mind. Jung, born in 1875 in the Swiss village of Keswil, had already begun his descent into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. The years between 1913 and 19 marked his most intense period of inner exploration, a time when he recorded his visions, his dialogues with inner figures, his encounters with what he termed the objective psyche. During these years, he was not conducting experiments in the conventional sense. He was instead becoming the subject of his own investigation, mapping territories that had no previous cartography. Picture Jung in his study, surrounded by books on alchemy, mythology, and Gnostic texts. The walls seemed to breathe with images, mandalas he had painted, symbols that emerged from his active imagination sessions. His method was introspective, phenomenological, rooted in the lived experience of the psyche's autonomous productions. He treated dreams not as random neural firings or wish fulfillments in the Freudian sense alone, but as messages from a deeper intelligence, a collective unconscious that spoke in the language of symbol and story. For Jung, the psyche was purposive, meaning-seeking, fundamentally oriented toward wholeness through a process he called individuation. His patients came to him with neuroses, yes, but also with a hunger for meaning that conventional medical psychology seemed unable to address. Jung listened not only to their symptoms, but to their dreams, their fantasies, their spiritual longings. He saw in their suffering a call toward transformation, an invitation from the unconscious to integrate split-off aspects of the personality, the shadow, the anima or animus, the self with its numinous quality. These were not mere concepts, but living realities he encountered first in himself and then recognized in those who sought his help. By the time the 1920s arrived, Jung had begun to articulate his analytical psychology more systematically, though he always resisted the impulse to create a closed system. He published Psychological Types in 1921, exploring how different orientations of consciousness, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition combined with attitudes of introversion and extroversion to create varied ways of experiencing reality. This work reflected his conviction that consciousness was not uniform but multifaceted, that the psyche contained within itself a multiplicity of perspectives and potentials. During these same years, across the Atlantic, a young boy was growing up in the small railroad town of Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. Burrhus Frederick Skinner, born in 1904, entered a world quite different from Jung's mythologically saturated childhood. Where Jung's early years were marked by his mother's emotional instability and his own visionary experiences, Skinner's youth was characterized by a love of building things, contraptions, mechanical devices, inventions. He was drawn to how things worked, to the visible mechanisms that produced observable results. Skinner's father was a lawyer, his mother a strong-willed woman who emphasized moral rectitude. The young Skinner attended Hamilton College in upstate New York, where he initially pursued literature and writing. He admired the novelist John Dos Passos and the poet Robert Frost, dreaming briefly of becoming a writer himself. But after graduating in 1926, he spent what he later called a dark year at home, attempting to write, but finding himself blocked, frustrated, questioning his direction. It was during this period of uncertainty that Skinner encountered the work of behavioral psychology, particularly the writings of John B. Watson and Ivan Pavlov. Watson's bold 1913 proclamation that psychology should be the science of behavior, not consciousness, struck Skinner as revolutionary. Here was a psychology that dealt in observables, in measurements, in predictions. Watson had declared that given a dozen healthy infants, he could train any one of them to become any type of specialist he might select: doctor, lawyer, even beggar or thief, regardless of the child's talents, tendencies, or ancestry. This environmental determinism, this faith in the malleability of behavior through conditioning, captivated the young Skinner. He abandoned his literary ambitions and enrolled in graduate school at Harvard University in 1928 to study psychology. But the psychology he chose to practice bore little resemblance to the introspective, meaning-laden approach Jung was developing in Zurich. Skinner was interested in behavior, in what organisms did, not in what they thought or felt or imagined. Inner states, he would come to argue, were either non-existent or at least inaccessible to scientific investigation. What mattered was the relationship between behavior and its consequences, the patterns of reinforcement that shaped and maintained actions. While Jung in the 1920s and 1930s was exploring synchronicity, studying alchemical texts, and developing his theory of archetypes, Skinner was in his laboratory refining what would become known as the operant conditioning chamber, colloquially called the Skinner box. This device, elegant in its simplicity, allowed him to study how rats and later pigeons learn through the systematic application of rewards and punishments. A hungry rat placed in the box would eventually press a lever, and when it did, food would appear. The rat would learn to press more frequently. Behavior, Skinner demonstrated, increased in frequency when followed by positive consequences and decreased when followed by negative ones or when positive consequences were withheld. The contrast between Jung's consulting room and Skinner's laboratory could hardly be more stark. Jung sat across from his patients, attending to their words, their silences, the images that arose spontaneously from their depths. He might ask them to paint, to sculpt, to engage in active imagination, dialoguing with dream figures or inner personalities. His data was qualitative, particular, deeply individual yet pointing toward universal patterns. Each analysan's journey was unique, yet Jung perceived recurring motifs: the hero's journey, the encounter with the shadow, the emergence of the self through the integration of opposites. Skinner, by contrast, worked with standardized environments, controlled variables, quantifiable outcomes. His subjects were initially animals, chosen precisely because they were simpler systems than humans, allowing for clearer observation of behavioral principles. He measured bar presses, pecking responses, latencies, and extinction curves. His graphs showed smooth learning curves, precise relationships between schedules of reinforcement and rates of responding. Where Jung saw symbols pregnant with multiple meanings, Skinner saw contingencies of reinforcement. Where Jung traced the mythic dimensions of human experience, Skinner plotted response frequencies. By 1938, when Skinner published The Behavior of Organisms, he had established himself as a rigorous experimentalist who was extending and refining the conditioning principles first explored by Pavlov and Watson. Classical conditioning, as Pavlov had demonstrated, involved pairing a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus until the neutral stimulus alone could elicit a response. The famous example of dogs salivating to a bell that had been paired with food illustrated this principle. But Skinner's operant conditioning focused on a different process: how the consequences of a behavior influenced its future occurrence. The organism operated on its environment, and the environment selected certain behaviors through reinforcement. This was a Darwinian conception of learning, natural selection at the level of individual behavior. Just as successful organisms survived and reproduced, successful behaviors, those followed by reinforcement, persisted and proliferated. There was no need to invoke inner states, desires, intentions, or meanings. The environment shaped behavior through its contingencies, and that was sufficient explanation. Jung would have recoiled from such reductionism. By the late 1930s, he had published extensively on the reality of the psyche, on its autonomous nature, on the numinous quality of archetypal experiences. His book, Psychology and Alchemy, published in 1944, but based on seminars and research from the previous decade, revealed the depths of his commitment to understanding the psyche as a meaning-generating system. He traced parallels between the dreams of modern patients and medieval alchemical imagery, demonstrating that the unconscious spontaneously produced symbols of transformation that echoed across centuries and cultures. For Jung, dreams were not learned behaviors. They were messages from the objective psyche, compensatory to consciousness, oriented toward wholeness. A patient might dream of descending into a dark cave and encountering a wise old man or woman, a manifestation of what Jung called the archetype of the wise old man or the great mother. These images were not conditioned responses, but autonomous productions of the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche Jung believed all humans shared, containing the accumulated experience of humanity crystallized into archetypal forms. Skinner would have none of this. Inner states, archetypes, the unconscious, these were. From his perspective, mentalistic fictions that obscured rather than illuminated the actual mechanisms of behavior. When Skinner eventually addressed the question of dreams in his later work, particularly in his 1974 book about behaviorism, he suggested that dreams were simply behaviors that occurred during sleep, shaped by the individual's reinforcement history. If you dreamed of flying, it was because flying had been associated with pleasure in your past experience, perhaps through actual experiences of swinging or jumping, perhaps through vicarious reinforcement from watching others or consuming media. There was no need to invoke a collective, unconscious, or archetypal meanings. Dreams were as subject to the laws of conditioning as any other behavior. The cultural context that produced these two radically different psychologies cannot be ignored. Jung emerged from a European tradition steeped in philosophy, particularly German idealism and Romanticism. He had studied Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. He was influenced by the symbolist movement, by the renewed interest in Gnosticism and esotericism, by the comparative study of world religions that was flourishing in his time. Switzerland itself, neutral and multilingual, positioned Jung at a crossroads of intellectual currents. He could draw from German depth psychology, French psychopathology, and his own Swiss tradition of Protestant introspection. Skinner, meanwhile, embodied American pragmatism and behaviorism's alliance with the natural sciences. The United States in the early 20th century was optimistic about technology, about the ability to engineer solutions to problems, about progress through scientific method. Watson's behaviorism fit this ethos perfectly. It was democratic in its environmental determinism, suggesting that proper conditioning could create capable individuals regardless of birth or background. It was practical, focused on prediction and control rather than interpretation and understanding. And it aligned psychology with physics and biology, distancing it from philosophy and the humanities. These cultural differences ran deep. Jung's psychology was aristocratic in a sense. It required lengthy analysis, cultural literacy, the ability to work with complex symbolism. His patients were often educated Europeans, grappling with spiritual crises. Skinner's psychology, by contrast, was egalitarian and materialist. It promised to work on anyone, regardless of their inner life or cultural background. You didn't need to understand mythology or alchemy. You simply needed to arrange the right contingencies of reinforcement. Neither man operated in isolation, of course. Jung's analytical psychology developed in dialogue with other depth psychologies. Freud's psychoanalysis, Adler's individual psychology, later the existential psychology of Ludwig Binswanger and Medard Boss. He corresponded with scholars of comparative religion like Mircea Eliade and with physicists like Wolfgang Pauli, exploring the relationship between psyche and matter, between synchronicity and quantum mechanics. His was a synthetic, integrative approach, drawing on disparate sources to create a multidimensional understanding of the psyche. Skinner, too, was part of a tradition and community. He engaged with other behaviorists, Clark Hull, Edward Tolman, Kenneth Spence, in debates about the proper formulation of learning theory. Later, he would influence and be influenced by cognitive psychology, though he remained critical of cognitive approaches that posited unobservable mental processes. His work attracted followers and critics across psychology, education, and philosophy. His 1948 novel Walden 2, depicting a utopian community organized according to behavioral principles, sparked passionate discussions about freedom, dignity, and social engineering. It's unlikely that Jung and Skinner ever met in person or corresponded directly. They moved in different circles, addressed different audiences, published in different venues. Yet their work represents two of the most influential and diametrically opposed approaches to understanding human nature that the 20th century produced. To place them in dialogue, then, is not to recount an actual historical exchange, but to illuminate the fundamental tensions within psychology itself, tensions that persist to this day. By the 1940s and 50s, both men had achieved considerable prominence in their respective domains. Jung, in his 70s, was an elder statesman of depth psychology, lecturing, writing, and refining his theories of individuation and the self. His collected works were being translated into English, finding audiences beyond continental Europe. He had established the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich in 1948, ensuring the continuation of his analytical approach. Skinner, now in his 40s and 50s, was at Harvard, where he would remain for most of his career. He had served during World War II, working on Project Pigeon, an attempt to train pigeons to guide missiles, a project that, though never implemented in combat, demonstrated his faith in the power of operant conditioning. After the war, he refined his experimental methods and extended his behavioral principles to increasingly complex phenomena, including language and culture. In 1953, Skinner published Science and Human Behavior, a comprehensive treatment of how operant conditioning principles applied to human life. Here he addressed topics Jung also considered emotion, motivation, self-control, social behavior, but from an entirely different framework. Where Jung saw emotion as affect-laden complexes connected to archetypal cores, Skinner analyzed emotion as behavior shaped by reinforcement history and current contingencies. Fear was not an inner state, but a set of responses conditioned through association with aversive stimuli. Love was not an archetypal experience, but a pattern of behaviors reinforced by another person's presence and actions. Motivation, for Jung, was fundamentally about meaning. The psyche sought wholeness, sought to integrate its disparate parts, sought to realize its potential through the individuation process. Symptoms, neurotic behaviors, anxieties, depressions were often signs that the conscious ego had drifted too far from the self's intentions, that unconscious contents were demanding attention. Healing came through recognizing and integrating these unconscious elements, through establishing a relationship between ego and self, between consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche. For Skinner, motivation was about deprivation and satiation relative to reinforcers. A hungry organism was motivated to behave in ways that had previously produced food. A lonely organism was motivated to seek social contact that had previously been reinforcing. There was no deeper meaning, no telos, no individuation. There was only the organism's current state relative to available reinforcers and its history of what behaviors had been effective in obtaining them. This divergence extended to their views on psychological development. Jung saw development as a lifelong process, particularly emphasizing the second half of life. The first half, he suggested, was properly focused on establishing oneself in the world, career, family, social position. But the second half called for a turn inward, a confrontation with mortality, with the unrealized potentials of the personality, with the question of meaning that worldly success could never fully answer. This was when individuation became most urgent, when the self pressed for recognition, when dreams and synchronicities often intensified. Skinner viewed development simply as the accumulation of conditioned behaviors. A child learned through reinforcement and punishment, gradually building a behavioral repertoire. An adult was simply someone with a more extensive history of conditioning. There was no fundamental shift, no call from the depths, no second half of life crisis. Change occurred when contingencies changed, when new behaviors were reinforced or old ones extinguished. If you wanted to understand an elderly person, you examined their reinforcement history, not their archetypal encounters. The question of free will stood as perhaps the sharpest point of divergence. Jung, despite his recognition of the unconscious's autonomy and its power to disrupt conscious intentions, maintained a vision of human freedom achieved through the individuation process. By becoming conscious of one's complexes, by integrating shadow elements, by establishing a relationship with the self, one gained a kind of psychological freedom. Not freedom from conditioning or biological influences, but freedom through greater self-knowledge and wholeness. The individuated person was not blown about by unconscious compulsions or collective pressures, but stood at the center of their own psychological existence, able to respond flexibly and consciously to life's demands. Skinner was more consistently deterministic. In his view, free will was an illusion born of our ignorance of the variables controlling behavior. We felt free when we didn't notice the reinforcement contingencies shaping our actions. But a scientific analysis revealed that behavior was always caused by prior conditions, genetic endowment, and environmental history. To speak of an autonomous agent making free choices was to invoke a homunculus, a little person inside the person, which explained nothing. Instead, we needed to recognize that we were our behavior, and our behavior was shaped by contingencies. This was not a pessimistic or degrading view, Skinner argued, but a liberating one, because it meant we could arrange better contingencies to produce better behavior. Jung would have found this liberation hollow. To reduce the human being to behavior shaped by reinforcement was to miss the essence of what made us human. Our capacity for symbolic thought, for meaningful suffering, for ethical choice, for spiritual transcendence. These were not epiphenomena or illusions, but the most real aspects of human existence, the very things that gave life, depth, and value. Yet we must not caricature Skinner as a crude mechanist who denied all subjective experience. In his later work, particularly about behaviorism, he acknowledged that private events, thoughts, feelings, sensations existed. His point was that these private events were themselves behaviors subject to the same principles as public behaviors, and that they were not causes but effects of environmental and genetic variables. You thought a certain thought because of your reinforcement history, not because of some autonomous mental faculty. You felt an emotion because of current contingencies and past associations, not because of an inner emotional center. This move, treating private events as behaviors rather than causes, was Skinner's attempt to acknowledge subjective experience while remaining within a behavioral framework. But it fundamentally missed what Jung was pointing to, the autonomous, purposive nature of psychic contents. When a dream image appeared, when a fantasy emerged, when a synchronicity occurred, these were not simply products of reinforcement history. They were communications from the objective psyche, often anticipatory, sometimes compensatory, always meaningful when properly understood. Consider how each man would have approached a patient presenting with depression. The person comes feeling empty, without purpose, going through the motions of life but finding no satisfaction. Jung would listen for clues about what the unconscious might be trying to communicate. Perhaps the depression was a necessary descent, a symbolic death that preceded rebirth, a negredo phase in the alchemical process of transformation. He would explore the person's dreams, looking for images that might point toward unrealized potentials, neglected aspects of personality, or the self's attempt to reorient consciousness. The symptom was meaningful, purposive, part of the psyche's self-regulation. Skinner would conduct a functional analysis, What reinforcers had been removed or reduced? Had the person lost a job, a relationship, a role that had previously provided reinforcement? What behaviors had been punished or extinguished? Perhaps the person had stopped engaging in activities that once brought pleasure because these activities were no longer reinforced. The treatment would involve behavioral activation, systematically increasing behaviors that were likely to produce reinforcement, restructuring the environment to provide more consistent positive consequences for adaptive behaviors. The symptom was not meaningful, but simply a result of an unfavorable reinforcement schedule. Both approaches might help the person, but they operated from entirely different premises about what a human being was and what healing entailed. For Jung, healing was a movement toward wholeness, toward the integration of consciousness and unconscious, toward living in alignment with the self's intentions. For Skinner, improvement was a change in behavioral patterns, an increase in behaviors that produced reinforcement, and a decrease in behaviors that produced punishment or extinction. The language each man used reflected these different orientations. Jung spoke of archetypes, complexes, the collective unconscious, individuation, the transcendent function, the coniunctio, the self. His vocabulary drew from alchemy, mythology, comparative religion, and depth psychology. It was poetic, evocative, polysemous. Each term opened into multiple meanings and associations. To understand Jung required immersion in his symbolic world, a willingness to think imagistically rather than linearly. Skinner's language was precise, operational, deliberately stripped of metaphor. Reinforcement, extinction, discrimination, generalization, shaping, schedules, contingencies. Each term referred to observable relationships between behavior and environment. His writing, at its best, had a clarity and directness that made complex ideas accessible. But this precision came at the cost of richness. There was no room in Skinner's vocabulary for the numinous, the archetypal, the sacred. During the 1950s and 60s, as both men reached the height of their influence, their divergent approaches reflected broader tensions in psychology. The field was fragmenting into schools and specialties, each with its own assumptions and methods. Behaviorism dominated American academic psychology, particularly in animal learning and applied settings. Depth psychologies, Freudian, Jungian, existential, remained influential in European clinical practice and among American psychotherapists, but were increasingly marginalized in university psychology departments. The cognitive revolution, beginning in the late 1950s, posed challenges to strict behaviorism. Researchers like George Miller, Ulrich Neisser, and Noam Chomsky argued that behaviorism could not account for complex cognitive processes like language acquisition, memory, and problem solving. Mental representations and information processing, they insisted, were necessary concepts for understanding human psychology. Skinner resisted this turn, arguing that cognitive psychology simply pushed the explanation back one step without solving the fundamental problem. To say behavior was caused by thoughts or mental representations just raised the question of what caused those thoughts and representations. Eventually, he maintained, you had to come back to environmental and genetic variables. Jung would have agreed with Skinner's skepticism of purely cognitive explanations, but for different reasons. Jung recognized that consciousness could not be understood in isolation from the unconscious. Mental representations and cognitive processes occurred within a much larger psychic system, one that included autonomous complexes, archetypal structures, and the compensatory function of the unconscious. The cognitive approach, like behaviorism, failed to appreciate the depth dimension of the psyche, the way images and symbols emerged from sources beyond the ego's control. Yet, Jung and the cognitivists shared a recognition that mind could not be bracketed out of psychology, that inner experience mattered. Dreams, fantasies, thoughts, feelings. These were not merely epiphenomena or private behaviors, but phenomena worthy of study in their own right. In this, both stood opposed to strict behaviorism's refusal to grant inner experience causal status or independent reality. Skinner's most controversial work came in 1971 with the publication of Beyond Freedom and Dignity. In this book, aimed at a general audience, he argued that concepts of autonomous man, freedom, and dignity were obstacles to solving social problems. These notions, he contended, attributed behavior to the individual's inner qualities rather than to environmental contingencies, and thus prevented us from designing better environments. If we wanted to reduce violence, pollution, overpopulation, and other social ills, we needed to arrange contingencies of reinforcement that would select pro-social behaviors. This was not tyranny, but enlightened design, no different in principle from arranging a classroom to facilitate learning or a workplace to increase productivity. The book provoked fierce criticism. Many readers saw in Skinner's proposals the specter of totalitarianism, of a manipulative elite arranging contingencies to control the masses. Who would design the designers? By what values would the contingencies be arranged? Skinner's responses to these questions were less than fully satisfying. He suggested that survival of the culture was the ultimate criterion, that cultures whose practices led to their own survival were better than those that didn't. But this seemed to beg the question of what made survival valuable, and ignored the possibility that a culture might survive while crushing individual flourishing. Jung. Had he lived to read Beyond Freedom and Dignity, he died in 1961, would have recognized in Skinner's vision the tyranny of the round. Collective over the individual, the very thing he had warned against throughout his work. Jung had lived through 2 world wars and the rise of fascism and communism. He had seen firsthand what happened when individuals were subordinated to collective ideologies, when the individual's inner life was deemed irrelevant or was coerced toward conformity. The individuation process, for Jung, was not merely personal development, but a bulwark against mass movements and totalitarian thinking. The individuated person could not be easily swept up in collective frenzy because they had established a relationship with their own depths, with the self that transcended collective identifications. Skinner might have replied that Jung's emphasis on individuation was itself a product of reinforcement history. Jung valued individualism because he lived in a culture and time that reinforced such values. There was nothing sacred or transcendent about individuation. It was simply a behavior pattern, shaped by particular contingencies. In different cultural contexts, other patterns, communalism, conformity, obedience, might be reinforced and thus appear natural and valuable. But this response would have missed Jung's point. Individuation was not cultural relativism or mere individualism. It was a universal process, archetypal in nature, appearing across cultures in the form of hero myths, initiation rituals, and spiritual disciplines. The outer forms varied, but the underlying pattern, the call to wholeness, the journey through darkness, the integration of opposites, the encounter with the self, appeared everywhere. This suggested something about human nature that transcended any particular culture's reinforcement contingencies. The question of human nature stood at the heart of their disagreement. Skinner famously stated that he could see no evidence for inner directing forces, for a self that was more than a repertoire of behaviors, for purposes or meanings, inherent in human existence. An organism came into the world with certain genetic endowments and proceeded to be shaped by its environment. Whatever patterns emerged, personality, preferences, beliefs, values, were products of this shaping. There was no essence, no telos, no deeper purpose beyond survival and reproduction as established by evolution. Jung saw human nature as rooted in the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche containing archetypes, universal, inherited patterns of psychological functioning. These archetypes were not learned. They were givens, part of what it meant to be human, just as having 2 eyes and 10 fingers were bodily givens. The mother archetype, the father archetype, the child archetype, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self. These were structural elements of the psyche, potentials that were activated by experience but not created by it. A child raised without a mother would still have the mother archetype, and it might be projected onto other figures or might cause psychological disturbance precisely because it hadn't been constellated in a healthy way. For Jung, archetypes gave shape and meaning to experience. They were the reason certain images appeared across cultures and epochs: the hero slaying the dragon, the divine child, the wise old man, the descent to the underworld. These were not learned patterns transmitted culturally, though culture certainly shaped their specific expressions. They were emergent properties of the human psyche, as universal as the structure of the body. Skinner would have relegated such patterns to coincidence or to unrecognized cultural transmission. Stories spread, ideas migrated, people imitated each other. There was no need to invoke a collective unconscious when social learning could explain cross-cultural similarities. Even if certain patterns appeared universally, this might simply reflect universal contingencies. All human cultures face similar problems of survival, reproduction, child-rearing, social organization. Similar environments would select similar behavioral solutions. This is the crux of the mechanistic versus imaginal paradigm. Skinner's psychology is mechanistic. It seeks to identify the laws governing behavior, to predict and control behavior through understanding and manipulating contingencies. It treats the organism as a system responding to inputs, its behavior shaped by consequences. There is no inside that is fundamentally different from the outside, no soul or psyche that transcends the laws of learning. Jung's psychology is imaginal. It recognizes the psyche as a reality unto itself, operating according to its own principles, producing images and symbols that cannot be reduced to external causes. The psyche has interiority, depth, autonomy. It speaks in dreams and visions, manifests in projections and transferences, seeks wholeness through the individuation process. To understand the psyche, you must learn its symbolic language, must approach it as you would approach a foreign culture or an artwork, with openness, patience, and a willingness to be changed by the encounter. These are not merely different methods, but different ontologies, different visions of what is real and what matters. For Skinner, what is real is behavior and the environmental contingencies that shape it. Inner experience, meanings, purposes, these are at best private behaviors and at worst illusions. For Jung, what is real includes the psyche in its full depth, the autonomous unconscious, the archetypes, the self, these are not reducible to behavior or brain states or environmental contingencies. They constitute a dimension of reality that demands its own methods of investigation. The contrast between their methods of investigation reveals this ontological divide. Skinner's method was experimental, control variables, manipulate independent variables, measure dependent variables, replicate findings. The goal was to establish general laws that applied across individuals and even across species. His research with rats and pigeons was not a limitation, but a feature. By studying simpler systems, he could identify principles more clearly, then test whether they applied to more complex cases. Jung's method was hermeneutic. Listen to the patient, attend to dreams, amplify images by connecting them to mythological and alchemical parallels, watch for repetitions and patterns. The goal was not general laws, but understanding of individual cases in their particularity, while recognizing universal patterns, archetypes, that appeared through individual variations. His research was clinical and introspective, grounded in extensive case studies and his own inner experiences. Each man distrusted the other's method. Skinner would have seen Jung's approach as unscientific, subjective, impossible to verify or falsify. How could you test whether an image was archetypal or merely personal? How could you measure individuation? How could you replicate a dream interpretation? Jung's psychology, from a behaviorist perspective, was not science but hermeneutics, dressed in scientific language. Jung, conversely, would have seen Skinner's method as missing the essential. You could measure bar presses and food pellets, but you couldn't measure the soul's longing for meaning. You could condition reflexes and operants, but you couldn't condition the encounter with the self, the most important aspects of human life: love, creativity, spiritual experience. The search for meaning either eluded operant analysis or were distorted beyond recognition when forced into its framework. This methodological divide reflected different relationships to measurement and quantification. Skinner believed that anything real could be measured, and that which couldn't be measured was either unreal or would eventually yield to better measurement techniques. Progress in psychology meant increasing precision in measuring behavior and identifying functional relationships between behavior and environment. Jung was skeptical of reducing psychological phenomena to quantities. He used word association tests early in his career and appreciated the insights they could provide, but he never believed that the psyche's essential nature could be captured in numbers. Some realities were qualitative, symbolic, meaningful in ways that resisted quantification. To insist on measuring everything was to commit a kind of violence against the phenomena, to force them into categories that distorted their nature. Yet we must note that neither man was entirely consistent. Skinner, despite his avowed focus on behavior, wrote extensively about internal states in his later years, trying to account for them within his system. He wrote about problem-solving, creativity, and even self-knowledge, stretching his behavioral framework to encompass phenomena that seemed inherently mental. Some critics argued he succeeded only by smuggling in cognitive concepts under behavioral labels. Jung, despite his emphasis on the symbolic and the qualitative, sought patterns and regularities. He developed typology, categorizing people by psychological functions and attitudes. He identified archetypal patterns that recurred across cases. He sought a science of the psyche, even if it was a science that looked different from physics or chemistry. He wanted his psychology to be empirical, grounded in observation, even if the observations were of internal phenomena and symbolic patterns rather than external behaviors. Perhaps, then, their opposition was not absolute. Perhaps each was responding to genuine aspects of human reality, and their conflict arose from overextending their insights into territory they couldn't adequately address. Skinner was brilliant at explaining how behaviors are learned and maintained through consequences. His principles work remarkably well for training animals, for teaching specific skills, for understanding habit formation. But behavior, important as it is not the whole of human existence. There is an inner life, a symbolic dimension, a search for meaning that behaviorism impoverishes or ignores. Jung was profound in his exploration of the psyche's depths, of the way symbol and myth shape human experience, of the individuation process and its crises and opportunities. But his psychology, particularly in its more mystical moments, risked losing connection with the body, with behavior, with the material conditions of life. Not everything is symbolic. Sometimes people need practical help changing concrete behaviors, not deeper understanding of archetypal patterns. A truly comprehensive psychology might integrate both perspectives, acknowledging both the power of environmental contingencies and the reality of inner experience, both the importance of behavior and the depths of symbolic meaning. Some contemporary approaches attempt this. Acceptance and commitment therapy, for example, draws on behavioral principles but emphasizes values and meaning. Dialectical behavior therapy combines behavioral skills training with validation of inner experience. Even neuroscience, in its better moments, recognizes that subjective experience is a phenomenon that needs to be explained, not explained away. But such integration was not available in the mid-20th century, when Skinner and Jung were at the height of their powers. Psychology was fragmented into competing schools, each defending its territory, each claiming to have the true understanding of human nature. To practice Jungian analysis was to reject behaviorism. To embrace behaviorism was to dismiss depth psychology as unscientific. The question of therapy and healing reveals their different visions most clearly. What did it mean to help someone? What was the goal of intervention? What constituted success? For Jung, therapy was a relationship between two people, both changed by the encounter. The analyst was not a neutral technician applying techniques, but a fellow human being who had undertaken their own individuation process and could serve as a guide and companion for the patient's journey. The goal was not symptom removal, though symptoms often resolved as the deeper work progressed. The goal was wholeness, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the establishment of a relationship with the self. Success looked like a person living more authentically, more fully, more creatively, not perfectly adjusted to society's demands, but aligned with their own deep nature. This process could not be standardized or manualized. Each analysis was unique because each psyche was unique. Jung might offer general guidance about typical patterns. The shadow often appears first, then the anima or animus, then the self, but the specific content, the timing, the crises and breakthroughs could not be predicted. The analyst had to be present, attentive, following the movements of the unconscious as revealed in dreams and active imagination. For Skinner, this was mystification. Therapy, or as he preferred to call it, behavior modification, was the systematic application of reinforcement principles to increase adaptive behaviors and decrease maladaptive ones. The therapist was indeed a technician, and that was not a limitation but a strength. Techniques could be tested, refined, standardized, taught. Success was measurable. Did the person engage in the target behaviors more frequently? Did they report greater satisfaction? Did objective measures show improvement? This approach could be manualized. You could write a protocol for treating a phobia through systematic desensitization, for reducing depression through behavioral activation, for improving social skills through shaping and reinforcement. A well-trained behavior therapist could achieve consistent results without needing to have had mystical experiences or undertaken a personal journey of individuation. Jung would have said that such an approach might change behavior but couldn't touch the soul. It treated symptoms as the problem rather than as messages from the unconscious. A phobia, for example, might symbolically represent something the person feared to confront in their life. Eliminating the phobia through desensitization without exploring its meaning might provide relief, but it wouldn't contribute to individuation. The psyche might produce a new symptom, or the person might continue feeling a vague dissatisfaction, a sense that something essential was missing. Skinner would have replied that attributing symbolic meaning to symptoms was reading too much into random associations. If systematic desensitization eliminated the phobia and the person felt better and functioned better, that was success. If another symptom appeared, which was rare, contrary to psychoanalytic claims of symptom substitution, it could be addressed with the same methods. As for vague dissatisfaction, that too could be analyzed functionally. What reinforcers were missing? What punishments present? Arrange better contingencies, and the person would feel better. The existential concerns that occupied Jung in the second half of life, mortality, meaning, purpose, were for Skinner problems of reinforcement schedules. If someone felt their life lacked meaning, it was because their current behaviors were not producing sufficient reinforcement. Perhaps they had retired and lost the daily reinforcement of work. Perhaps their children had grown and moved away, removing a major source of social reinforcement. The solution was not to dive into the depths of the unconscious, but to identify new sources of reinforcement, new activities and relationships that would provide satisfaction. Jung found such analysis shallow, beyond words. Meaning was not reducible to reinforcement. A person could have all the external rewards, success, relationship, comfort, and still experience profound meaninglessness if they had not addressed the deeper questions of existence. The midlife crisis, which Jung saw as archetypal, arose precisely when worldly success revealed itself as insufficient. The psyche demanded more, demanded that you confront your mortality, integrate your shadow, encounter the self. These were not problems of reinforcement scheduling, but initiations into psychological and spiritual depths. Dreams provided a crucial test case for their competing visions. Jung devoted decades to studying dreams. He accumulated thousands of dream series from patients and from his own inner life. He saw dreams as the natural product of the unconscious, compensating for the one-sidedness of consciousness, anticipating future developments, expressing instinctual drives, manifesting archetypal patterns. Dreams, properly understood, were guides to the individuation process. They showed what consciousness had neglected, what the shadow contained, how the psyche was attempting to move toward wholeness. Jung developed a method of dream interpretation that avoided reducing dreams to fixed symbols. A snake in a dream might relate to healing, to transformation, to the shadow, to sexuality, to the earth, to wisdom, The meaning depended on the dreamer's associations, on the context of the dream, on the series of dreams, on the dreamer's life situation, amplification, connecting the dream image to mythological parallels, could reveal its archetypal dimension. But ultimately, a dream interpretation was valid only if it resonated with the dreamer, if it produced an aha experience that indicated the unconscious had been correctly understood. Skinner's approach to dreams, articulated most clearly in About Behaviorism, was radically different. Dreams were behaviors that occurred during sleep, he argued. They were shaped by the same principles as waking behaviors by the dreamer's reinforcement history. If you dreamed of being chased, it was because being chased had been associated with fear in your experience, and the neural patterns associated with those experiences were reactivated during sleep. If you dreamed of a loved one, it was because that person had been a source of reinforcement and representations of them were being processed during sleep. This approach stripped dreams of their symbolic power and their prospective function. A dream of being chased was not a message from the unconscious about something you were avoiding in waking life. It was simply a replay or recombination of fear-related experiences. There was no need to interpret it, no hidden meaning to uncover. At best, dreams might reveal what experiences had been most significant in your reinforcement history, but they offered no wisdom, no guidance, no anticipation of future developments. Jung would have seen this as a catastrophic impoverishment of dream life. Dreams, in his extensive experience, regularly contained images and themes dreamer had never encountered in waking life, at least not consciously. A patient might dream of alchemical symbols they had never studied, of mythological figures they had never heard of. When these images were amplified, when mythological parallels were drawn, the dreams often proved to be expressing profound psychological truths about the dreamer's situation. Even more striking were the prospective dreams. Jung documented dreams that anticipated future developments in the dreamer's life or psyche. A patient might dream of an encounter with a wise figure who offered guidance, and this guidance proved relevant to challenges that emerged weeks or months later. How could reinforcement history account for such anticipatory dreams? They suggested that the unconscious had a kind of intelligence, a capacity to perceive patterns and potentials not yet visible to consciousness. Skinner would have likely attributed such examples to coincidence, to post hoc interpretation, to the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. If you interpret dreams symbolically, you can make them mean almost anything, and occasionally an interpretation will seem prescient simply by chance. This was not evidence of unconscious intelligence, but of confirmation bias and the flexibility of symbolic interpretation. Yet the sheer volume of Jung's dream material, collected over decades from hundreds of patients, makes the coincidence explanation less satisfying. Dream series showed developmental patterns, recurring symbols that evolved over time, crises in the dreams that corresponded to crises in consciousness. The unconscious seemed to be conducting its own process, one that could be tracked through dreams, one that aimed toward wholeness even when consciousness resisted. The question of human autonomy and dignity, raised most explicitly in Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity, reveals perhaps the deepest ethical divide between them. Skinner argued that notions of autonomous man, of inner freedom, of inherent dignity, were obstacles to creating a better world. If we believed people were free agents responsible for their actions, we would focus on praise and blame, reward and punishment of the person, rather than on redesigning environments. If we believed people had inherent dignity regardless of their behavior, we might fail to shape behaviors that were genuinely admirable. For Skinner, What we called freedom was simply behavior controlled by positive rather than aversive contingencies. A free person was one whose behavior was maintained by positive reinforcement rather than by the threat of punishment. This was certainly preferable, but it was not freedom in the philosophical sense. The person was still controlled, just by more pleasant means. Similarly, dignity was simply the reinforcement we received from others when we behaved in ways they valued. There was nothing inherent or intrinsic about it. This position horrified many readers, including theologians, philosophers, and humanistic psychologists. It seemed to reduce humans to machines, to deny what made us unique, to eliminate moral responsibility. If behavior was entirely determined by contingencies, how could anyone be held accountable? If there was no autonomous self, what was the locus of moral choice? Skinner's response was that accountability was itself a contingency. We held people responsible not because they truly possessed free will, but because doing so was an effective contingency for controlling behavior. Praise and blame, reward and punishment, guilt and shame. These were social mechanisms that cultures had evolved to shape individual behavior. They worked not by reaching some inner autonomous self, but by establishing contingencies. Understanding this didn't eliminate accountability. It made it more effective by helping us design better contingencies. Jung's position was more complex. He recognized that we were not fully autonomous, that unconscious forces often drove our behavior, that consciousness was a small island in a vast sea of the psyche. We were subject to archetypal patterns, to the influence of the collective unconscious, to possession by complexes. In this sense, he shared Skinner's skepticism about naive notions of free will, but Jung saw the individuation process as a movement toward greater freedom, not through eliminating the unconscious, but through establishing a conscious relationship with it. The individuated person was not controlled by unconscious forces because those forces had been recognized, their images had been integrated, their energy had been consciously assimilated. This person could not be easily possessed by archetypal patterns or collective movements because they had developed a strong ego-self axis, a connection between consciousness and the center of the psyche. This was freedom through self-knowledge, through wholeness, through conscious relationship with the totality of the psyche. It was not freedom from causation, but freedom within it, the freedom to respond consciously rather than react unconsciously. This vision preserved human dignity not as something inherent and static, but as something achieved through the difficult work of individuation, through facing the shadow, through integrating the opposites, through realizing the self. For Jung, the self was the archetype of wholeness, the center of the psyche that transcended the ego yet included it. Experiences of the self were numinous, marked by a sense of profound significance, of touching something greater than the personal ego. Such experiences in dreams, in nature, in relationships, in creative work, in moments of synchronicity, were what gave life ultimate meaning. They pointed toward a dimension of existence that transcended environmental contingencies and reinforcement histories. Skinner's system had no place for the numinous, for experiences of the sacred, for encounters with the transcendent. These were, at best, emotional responses conditioned through association with culturally valued symbols and practices. If you felt awe in a cathedral, it was because cathedrals had been associated with reinforcement in your history, perhaps through social approval of religious participation or through the pairing of the cathedral setting with comforting rituals. There was no genuine transcendence, no contact with something beyond the natural order. Jung's insistence on the reality of spiritual experience put him at odds with the materialism dominant in 20th century science. He was careful to say he could not prove God's existence metaphysically, but could demonstrate that the psyche naturally produced images and experiences of the divine, that the God image was archetypal, appearing across cultures and epochs. Whether God existed independently of the psyche was a metaphysical question beyond psychology's scope, but that the psyche sought and experienced the divine was an empirical observation. This phenomenological approach to spirituality was foreign to Skinner's thinking. For him, religious and spiritual behaviors were maintained, like any others, by reinforcement from religious communities, by the reduction of anxiety that religious beliefs provided, by the social status and structure religion offered. As societies secularized and these reinforcers weakened, religious behavior declined, exactly as a behavioral analysis would predict. There was no need to invoke archetypal needs or spiritual longings. People were spiritual when being spiritual was reinforced, and weren't when it wasn't. Yet Skinner's own life contained elements that a Jungian might interpret as symptoms of meaning hunger. Despite his fame and success, Skinner struggled with periods of depression and doubt. His diaries reveal a man concerned with his legacy, with whether his work would endure, with whether he had made a real difference. These concerns about meaning and significance suggest needs that transcended simple reinforcement schedules. Why did he care about his legacy if he was merely a locus of behavior shaped by contingencies? Why write books aimed at changing culture if there was no autonomous self capable of choosing differently? Jung might have said that Skinner was possessed by an archetypal pattern he didn't recognize, perhaps the archetype of the Senex, the wise old lawgiver, attempting to create a rational order, or perhaps a heroic pattern of struggling against ignorance and superstition. By not recognizing these archetypal influences, by not integrating them consciously, Skinner was more controlled by them, not less. His rationalism and determinism might themselves have been defensive, protecting against the irrational and the numinous that threatened his worldview. But this psychologizing of Skinner would cut both ways. A behaviorist could analyze Jung's commitment to the unconscious, to archetypes, to individuation, as behaviors shaped by his own unique reinforcement history. Jung's difficult relationship with his mother, his visionary experiences as a child, his break with Freud, his immersion in occult and religious literature, all of these could be seen as establishing contingencies that made depth psychology reinforcing for him. His theory was not a discovery of objective truth, but a construction maintained by the reinforcement it provided: professional success, patient gratitude, intellectual stimulation, the sense of having special insight. This mutual psychologizing reveals a fundamental problem. Each framework can explain the other away, treating the opposing viewpoint as a product of its own mechanisms. Skinner can reduce Jung's psychology to behavioral patterns. Jung can reduce Skinner's psychology to defensive rationalism. Neither can definitively refute the other, because each operates from different premises about what counts as evidence and explanation. This impasse is not unique to Jung and Skinner, but reflects a broader problem in psychology and philosophy, the problem of incommensurable paradigms. When two frameworks differ in their basic assumptions about what is real, what methods are valid, and what questions are worth asking, there may be no neutral ground from which to adjudicate between them. You cannot prove to a behaviorist that inner experience is causally efficacious using only behavioral evidence, because behaviorism defines inner experience as epiphenomenal. You cannot prove to a Jungian that symbols are merely conditioned responses using only symbolic interpretation, because Jungian method specifically attends to meanings that transcend conditioning. Yet this incommensurability need not lead to relativism or despair. We can acknowledge that different frameworks illuminate different aspects of human existence. Behaviorism excels at explaining habit formation, skill acquisition, the role of consequences in maintaining behavior. Jungian psychology excels at exploring symbolic meaning, spiritual longing, the integration of consciousness and unconscious. A full understanding of human life might require both, even if we cannot neatly integrate them into a single theory. Consider the phenomenon of artistic creation. A painter sits before a blank canvas and, over hours or days, creates an image. How do we understand this process? Skinner's analysis would focus on the shaping of painting behavior through reinforcement. The painter has a history of being reinforced for painting, perhaps through art teachers' praise, through the pleasure of seeing images emerge, through sales of finished works, through social admiration. The specific strokes and choices are shaped by previous reinforcements. This color combination worked well before that composition pleased viewers. The painter paints because painting has been reinforced and will paint subjects and styles that have been most strongly reinforced in their history. Jung's analysis would be entirely different. The painter is in dialogue with the unconscious. Images emerge spontaneously, autonomous contents of the psyche seeking expression. The painter may start with a conscious plan, but finds the painting evolving in unexpected directions, guided by something beyond conscious intention. When the work succeeds, when it feels right, it's because the painter has successfully manifested an inner vision, has given form to psychic content. The painting may contain archetypal symbols, mandalas, the mother, the child, the shadow, even if the painter wasn't consciously aware of these dimensions. Viewers respond not merely because they've been conditioned to approve of such art, but because the painting activates archetypal patterns in their own psyches. Neither explanation is complete. The behavioral account captures something real about how painting skills are acquired and maintained, but misses the experience of inspiration, of the image that seems to arrive from beyond the conscious mind. The Jungian account honors that creative mystery, but perhaps underplays the role of training, practice, and the influence of artistic traditions and market forces. A genuine integration would acknowledge both dimensions, the behavioral and the symbolic, the conditioned and the archetypal, the environmental and the depth psychological. But such integration remains more aspiration than achievement in contemporary psychology, which continues to fragment into specialties that often don't communicate with each other. The question of therapy outcomes provides another instructive comparison. Does therapy work? Which therapy works best? For what problems? Modern psychotherapy research attempts to answer these questions through randomized controlled trials comparing different treatments for specific disorders. The results show that many therapies work, that some treatments are more effective than others for specific problems, that the therapeutic relationship matters significantly, and that there's substantial overlap in outcomes across different theoretical orientations. From a Skinnerian perspective, these findings make sense. All therapies, regardless of their theoretical rationale, involve arranging contingencies. The therapist reinforces certain behaviors and thoughts, extinguishes others, provides a context where new behaviors can be shaped. The therapeutic relationship matters because the therapist becomes a powerful reinforcer. Attention, warmth, understanding from the therapist are reinforcing and thus shape client behavior. Different techniques work for different problems because problems involve different behavioral patterns requiring different contingency arrangements. From a Jungian perspective, the research findings are less relevant. Randomized trials study symptom reduction, not individuation. They measure behaviors and self-reports, not depth of self-knowledge or integration of the unconscious. They standardize treatment through manuals, eliminating the responsiveness to individual psychic development that is essential to genuine analysis. And they focus on short-term outcomes, missing the long-term transformation that individuation involves. Jung would not have been surprised that many therapies produce similar results for symptom relief. Symptoms are often surface manifestations of deeper issues. Many approaches might provide temporary relief without touching the depths, but only depth analysis, in his view, addressed the fundamental need for meaning, for wholeness, for conscious relationship with the unconscious. This could not be measured on symptom checklists or demonstrated in 12-week treatment protocols. Skinner might have replied that if Jung's approach couldn't demonstrate its effectiveness through research, that was a problem for Jung's approach, not for research. Science advances through testable claims and empirical evidence. If individuation was a real phenomenon with real benefits, it should be possible to operationalize it, measure it, study it systematically. If it remained forever in the realm of subjective interpretation and clinical anecdote, it was more art or philosophy than science. But Jung's defender might respond that not everything real is measurable in behavioral terms. Love, beauty, meaning, spiritual experience, these are real and important, even if they resist quantification. A psychology that limits itself to what can be measured in randomized trials will miss the most important aspects of human existence. Better a rich, qualitative understanding of individuals in their depth than a precise but shallow understanding of behaviors abstracted from meaning. This debate continues in contemporary psychology. Evidence-based practice has become the standard, with treatments validated through research generally preferred over those lacking such validation. This has led to the dominance of cognitive behavioral approaches, which are more amenable to manualization and outcome research. Depth psychologies, including Jungian analysis, occupy a smaller niche, often outside academic psychology departments, more in private practice and training institutes. Yet there's growing recognition that evidence-based practice shouldn't be narrowly interpreted. Evidence comes in multiple forms, not only randomized trials, but also systematic case studies, qualitative research, clinical observation. An outcome matters, but so does process what happens in the therapy, how change occurs, what the lived experience is for client and therapist. These dimensions require methods beyond behavioral measurement. Some contemporary therapies attempt to bridge behavioral and depth approaches. Mentalization-based therapy, for instance, draws on psychodynamic understanding while incorporating structured techniques. Emotion-focused therapy works with emotional experience in ways that honor its symbolic and meaningful dimensions while also including behavioral elements. These integrative approaches suggest that the either-or framework, either behavioral or depth, either Skinner or Jung, may be too limiting. The cultural legacy of these two thinkers has been vastly different. Skinner became perhaps the most famous psychologist of the 20th century among the general public. His novels Walden II and Beyond Freedom and Dignity were widely read and debated. His ideas influenced education through programmed instruction and teaching machines, influenced therapy through behavior modification, influenced society through applications in business, military training, and institutional settings. The term Skinner box entered common parlance. His vision of a behaviorally engineered society, whether embraced or feared, shaped discussions of human nature and social policy. Jung's influence was more diffuse and culturally varied. In Europe, particularly German-speaking countries, he remained a major figure in psychology and psychiatry. Jungian analysts, trained in institutes around the world, maintained a tradition of depth psychological work. But Jung's broader cultural impact came through unexpected channels: mythology, comparative religion, the study of symbols, the New Age movement, popular psychology. His concepts, introvert and extrovert, the shadow, archetypes entered common language, often in simplified or distorted forms. Artists, writers, and filmmakers drew on Jungian ideas more than on behaviorism. Joseph Campbell's work on comparative mythology was deeply influenced by Jung. James Hillman's archetypal psychology extended and revised Jungian thought. Jungian themes appeared in literature from Hermann Hesse to Ursula Le Guin, in films from Star Wars to The Matrix. The hero's journey, the encounter with the shadow, the integration of opposites, the search for meaning, these Jungian motifs pervade contemporary storytelling. Why did Jung's ideas prove more fertile for culture and arts, while Skinner's influenced policy and institutions? Perhaps because Jung spoke to perennial human concerns, meaning purpose, identity, spirituality, while Skinner offered technical solutions to practical problems. Art explores the depths of human experience, the mysteries and ambiguities that resist rational explanation. Behaviorism, by design, eliminates mystery, reduces complexity to measurable variables, clarifies rather than enriches. Yet Skinner's influence in practical domains should not be underestimated. Applied behavior analysis has helped countless individuals with developmental disabilities learn essential skills. Behavioral principles inform effective teaching practices, organizational management, habit change programs, token economies, contingency contracts, functional behavior assessments. These applications of operant conditioning have demonstrable effects. Jung's practical impact is harder to quantify, but no less real. Individuals who underwent Jungian analysis often report profound transformations, new understandings of themselves, capacity to live more authentically. The individuation process, while unmeasurable in conventional terms, represents a genuine developmental achievement. And Jung's insistence that life's second half requires inward turning, that success alone doesn't satisfy the psyche's need for meaning, has helped countless people navigate midlife crises and aging. Perhaps the most important question is not which approach is correct, but what each reveals and conceals. Every theoretical framework illuminates certain phenomena while obscuring others. Behaviorism reveals the power of environmental contingencies, the malleability of behavior, the importance of consequences, but it conceals inner experience, meaning the autonomous psyche. Jungian psychology reveals the depths of symbolic life, the reality of spiritual seeking, the purposiveness of the unconscious, but it may underplay the role of learning and environment, the importance of concrete behavior change, the ways social contingencies shape experience. A wise psychology might hold both perspectives, knowing when each is most applicable. For teaching a child to read, for helping someone overcome a specific phobia, for training employees in safety procedures, behavioral principles are invaluable. For exploring the meaning of a recurring dream, for understanding a midlife crisis, for working through grief or existential despair, depth psychological approaches have more to offer. But this pragmatic eclecticism, sensible as it sounds, was not available to Skinner or Jung. Each was committed to a comprehensive vision of psychology, a vision that explained not just some phenomena, but the whole of human nature. To admit that their approaches were limited, applicable only in certain domains, would have undermined their projects. They were not offering tools in a toolkit, but frameworks for understanding what it means to be human. And so they remain irreconcilable, these two visions of psychology. One sees human beings as behavior shaped by environment, the other as psyche seeking wholeness. One reduces consciousness to conditioned responses, the other expands it to include collective unconscious. One eliminates meaning as illusion, the other centers it as the psyche's essential need. One works in laboratories with controlled variables, the other in consulting rooms with symbolic dialogue. As we approach the end of this long contemplation, as your mind drifts towards sleep, consider what their dialogue reveals about the challenges of understanding ourselves. We are simultaneously organisms responding to environment and subjects experiencing meaning. We are shaped by reinforcement and driven by archetypal patterns. We learn through consequences and transform through symbolic encounter. We are mechanisms and mysteries, behaviors and souls. Jung once wrote that psychology could not be a natural science because its object, the psyche, was simultaneously the subject doing the investigating. We cannot step outside our psyches to study them objectively the way we study chemical reactions or planetary orbits. Every psychological theory reflects the psyche of its creator, is shaped by that creator's complexes, compensates for their one-sidedness, expresses archetypal patterns active in them. Skinner, though he would have rejected Jung's language, might have agreed with the underlying point. His behaviorism was itself behavior, shaped by his reinforcement history, by the contingencies of academic psychology, by the culture of 20th century American science. His insistence on environmental determinism may have been reinforced precisely because it contradicted earlier mentalistic psychologies, because it provoked debate, because it earned him prominence. Neither man had the final word, because there can be no final word about human nature. We are too complex, too context-dependent, too capable of self-transformation to be captured by any single theory. Jung's archetypes and Skinner's reinforcement schedules both point to realities of human existence, but neither exhausts it. The mechanistic paradigm that Skinner exemplifies has given us technological mastery, predictive power, practical applications. We can shape behavior, train skills, modify habits with increasing precision. But this mastery comes at a cost: the reduction of human existence to observable behaviors, the elimination of inner life, the loss of meaning and depth. The imaginal paradigm that Jung exemplifies has given us symbolic richness, spiritual depth, appreciation of the psyche's complexity and purposiveness. We can explore dreams, encounter archetypes, pursue individuation toward wholeness. But this depth comes with its own cost, difficulty in testing claims, risk of unfalsifiable speculation, potential for inflation when archetypal patterns are not grounded in lived reality. Perhaps wisdom lies in recognizing that we need both, need behavioral science for certain tasks and depth psychology for others, need measurement and mystery, need prediction and meaning. But such integration has proven elusive in psychology as a discipline, which continues to fragment into competing schools and specialties. What, then, can we learn from the confrontation between Jung and Skinner? First, that our understanding of human nature depends profoundly on our methods. The questions you ask, the evidence you consider valid, the framework you adopt, all of these shape what you discover. Skinner's experimental method led him to behavioral principles. Jung's introspective and clinical method led him to archetypes and individuation. Neither was simply seeing reality as it is. Each was constructing an understanding shaped by their approach. Second, that comprehensiveness comes at a price. Both Jung and Skinner wanted to explain all of human psychology, behavior, emotion, thought, development, pathology, culture. This ambition led each to overextend their core insights, to force phenomena into frameworks where they didn't quite fit. Skinner's attempt to account for language through reinforcement-strained credulity. Jung's claim that archetypes explained everything from religious experience to schizophrenia sometimes seemed more poetic than demonstrable. Third, that values are inseparable from psychological theory. Skinner valued prediction, control, environmental determination, behavioral engineering. Jung valued meaning, wholeness, inner experience, symbolic understanding. These values shaped their theories at every level, determined what they investigated and how they interpreted findings. The fantasy of value-free science, of psychology as pure description of facts, conceals the way theoretical frameworks embody visions of what matters and how we should live. Fourth, that the question of what makes us human resists simple answers. Are we mechanisms or meanings, behaviors or souls, conditioned responses or archetypal patterns? The answer seems to be yes, we are all of these. And the challenge is holding the tension between perspectives rather than collapsing into one side or the other. This is, in Jungian terms, the reconciliation of opposites, the transcendent function that creates new understanding from the clash of contraries. As you drift now towards sleep, let these images settle into your consciousness. Picture Skinner in his laboratory, surrounded by operant chambers, graphs, cumulative recorders, watching pigeons peck keys with mathematical precision. He sees pattern, lawfulness, the power of contingencies to shape behavior. His face shows concentration, satisfaction, the pleasure of scientific discovery. He has found principles that work, that predict, that enable control. Now picture Jung in his study at Bollingen, the tower he built stone by stone with his own hands. The walls are thick, the windows small, the atmosphere timeless. He sits surrounded by alchemical texts, mandala paintings, dream journals. He attends to images rising from within, encounters inner figures, dialogues with the unconscious. His face shows gravity, wonder, the weight of numinous experience. He has found depths that speak, symbols that guide, a self that seeks realization. These two men never met, never corresponded, likely never read each other's work with care. Yet their lives and works represent two fundamental orientations to human existence that psychology cannot ignore. One maps the surface, the observable, the lawful. The other descends to depths, the symbolic, the meaningful. One offers behavioral engineering, the other psychological transformation. One studies organisms responding to environment, the other psyches seeking wholeness. Neither had the complete picture, because there is no complete picture, no God's eye view from which all perspectives merge into perfect understanding. We are embodied creatures, finite in our capacities, shaped by our histories and contexts. Our psychologies reflect who we are and what we value. The behaviorist and the depth psychologist, the experimentalist and the analyst, the engineer and the mystic, each reveals something true while concealing something else. Perhaps the deepest wisdom is to hold both, to honor both the mechanism and the mystery, to recognize that we are simultaneously shaped by contingencies and called by meaning, simultaneously behaviors to be trained and souls to be realized. This holding of opposites, this refusal of premature synthesis, is itself a Jungian attitude, the transcendent function that creates new consciousness from the tension between contraries. The contribution of Skinner endures in behavioral science, in applied behavior analysis, in the recognition that consequences matter, that environment shapes us, that behavior can be changed through systematic intervention. His vision of a behaviorally engineered society remains controversial, but his technical achievements in understanding learning are undeniable. He clarified the mechanisms by which habits form and persist, by which new skills are acquired, by which behavior adapts to changing contingencies. The contribution of Jung endures in depth psychology, in the study of dreams and symbols, in the recognition that psyche seeks meaning, that images emerge autonomously, that life's second half demands inward turning. His vision of individuation as the goal of human development remains inspiring, even if its achievement is rare. He revealed depths in the psyche that behaviorism misses entirely, dimensions of experience that cannot be reduced to reinforcement schedules. We need not choose between them, though historically psychology has oscillated, now toward behaviorism, now toward cognitive or humanistic or depth approaches. Each oscillation reveals dissatisfaction with previous narrowness, a recognition that something essential has been left out. Behaviorism's dominance in mid-20th century prompted the cognitive revolution and the humanistic movement, both insisting that consciousness and meaning could not be eliminated. But cognitivism's computational metaphors and humanism's sometimes vague optimism led some back to behaviorism's rigor. Meanwhile, outside academic psychology, people continue to dream, to search for meaning, to encounter numinous experiences that transform their lives. They undergo Jungian analysis or read Jung's works, finding in them acknowledgement of depths their psyches know but mainstream psychology ignores. They work with behavioral therapists, grateful for practical tools to change habits and overcome fears. They are not troubled by theoretical incompatibilities, taking what helps from wherever it comes. This pragmatic wisdom of practitioners and seekers may be wiser than theoretical purity. Life is larger than any system, psyche more complex than any model. We contain multitudes, in Whitman's phrase. We are shaped by environment and driven by archetypes, conditioned by reinforcement and called by individuation, mechanisms, and mysteries. The dialogue between Jung and Skinner, then, is ultimately a dialogue within each of us, between our behavioral surfaces and psychic depths, between our conditioned responses and autonomous images, between our practical functioning and our search for meaning. To deny either side is to lose something essential. As you slip now into sleep, let these two figures accompany you, the experimentalist and the mystic, the engineer and the analyst, Skinner and Jung. They represent possibilities, polarities, perspectives on the endlessly fascinating question of what it means to be human. Their opposition illuminates rather than resolves, opens rather than closes, invites continued reflection rather than offering final answers. In your dreams tonight, you may encounter both the mechanisms that shape your behavior and the symbols that call you toward wholeness, the contingencies that constrain you and the archetypes that guide you, the behavioral patterns you repeat and the depths you've yet to explore. Your psyche contains them both, the observable and the invisible, the measurable and the meaningful. Jung might say your dreams will speak in symbols, will offer compensatory images, will reveal what consciousness has neglected. They will show you shadows you've denied, potentials you've ignored, the self that seeks realization through you. Attend to them, amplify them, let them guide your individuation. Skinner might say your dreams are neural patterns shaped by your reinforcement history, recombinations of experiences that were significant enough to leave traces. They reflect what mattered in your waking life, what was reinforced, what you learned. There is no hidden message, no need for interpretation, just the processing of experience during sleep. Who is right? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps the question itself is wrong. Dreams are what they are, mysterious, meaningful, strange, revealing. We can analyze them behaviorally or symbolically, reduce them to mechanisms, or expand them to mythic proportions. Each approach yields insights. Each has limitations. What matters most is that you keep dreaming, keep questioning, keep exploring the inexhaustible mystery of consciousness and the psyche. Whether you call it behavior or soul, conditioning or individuation, mechanism or meaning, it is your life, your one precious life, unfolding moment by moment between birth and death. Skinner spent his final years writing, always writing, trying to get his ideas precisely formulated, hoping to influence future generations, convinced that behavior analysis could solve humanity's problems if only we would embrace it fully. He died in 1990, having seen his influence wane somewhat as cognitive approaches gained prominence, but still convinced of his fundamental insights. Jung died in 1961, his work largely complete, but his influence just beginning to spread beyond analytical psychology to wider culture. His final days included visions he shared with his associate and caregiver, images of wholeness and completion. He had descended into the unconscious and returned, had mapped psychic territories and left guides for others to follow. His legacy would grow in unexpected ways, touching art and spirituality, mythology and comparative religion, far beyond the consulting room. Both men lived long lives devoted to understanding human nature. Both influenced millions, though in different ways. Both created frameworks that continue to provoke thought and guide practice decades after their deaths. Both were limited by their times, their cultures, their personal complexes and blind spots. Both deserve respect for the depth of their commitment and the breadth of their ambition. But more than their individual contributions, their contrast illuminates psychology itself as a discipline caught between competing visions, scientific and hermeneutic, objective and subjective, mechanistic and imaginal. This tension is not a problem to be solved, but a creative polarity to be maintained. Psychology needs both rigor and richness, both measurement and meaning, both behavioral precision and symbolic depth. The mechanistic paradigm, exemplified by Skinner, gives us clarity, testability, practical power. We can train, shape, modify, predict, with increasing accuracy. This is genuine knowledge, genuine achievement, but it is knowledge of surfaces, of functions, of patterns. It cannot touch the depths where meaning emerges, where symbols speak, where the soul seeks realization. The imaginal paradigm, exemplified by Jung, gives us depth, resonance, existential significance. We can explore, interpret, integrate, transform through symbolic work. This too is genuine knowledge, genuine achievement. But it is knowledge resistant to verification, prone to inflation, difficult to teach systematically. It requires a calling, not just training, and it works on timescales longer than research grants or treatment protocols. Perhaps the ultimate lesson is epistemological humility, recognizing that our frameworks are lenses, not direct apprehensions of reality. Skinner's behaviorism is a powerful lens for examining certain phenomena, but distorts others. Jung's analytical psychology is a profound lens for exploring psychic depths, but may project patterns where simpler explanations suffice. The wise student of psychology learns multiple lenses, knows their strengths and limitations, applies them appropriately. The wise person seeking self-understanding draws from multiple traditions, taking what helps without demanding theoretical consistency. Life is too complex for single stories, psyche too multifaceted for single frameworks. As this long contemplation draws to a close, as sleep claims you fully rest in the knowledge that you are more than any theory can capture. Your behavior shaped by contingencies and psyche seeking meaning, mechanism and mystery, surface and depth. You are simultaneously Skinnerian organism and Jungian soul, responding to reinforcement and called toward individuation. Neither perspective exhausts you. Neither framework contains you. You exceed all theories, all models, all attempts at complete understanding. And this excess, this mystery that remains after all analysis, is perhaps the most important truth, that we are fundamentally unknown to ourselves, that depths remain unexplored, that the psyche holds secrets no psychology will ever fully reveal. Jung honored this mystery, even as he tried to map it. Skinner sought to eliminate it, to bring everything into the light of scientific explanation. Their opposition reveals two fundamental human responses to the unknown: embrace and reduction, exploration and control, poetry and prose. We need both responses. We need the clarity that comes from behavioral analysis and the richness that comes from symbolic exploration. We need Skinner's precision and Jung's profundity. We need laboratory and consulting room, measurement and interpretation, observation and imagination. Sleep now, wanderer, with dreams shaped by contingencies and guided by archetypes, dreams that are simultaneously neural patterns and symbolic messages, dreams that reveal how thoroughly we are both and how completely we exceed either or. Sleep with the knowledge that psychology's great debates continue because human nature resists final formulation, because we are endlessly complex, endlessly fascinating, endlessly mysterious. Skinner and Jung, behaviorism and analytical psychology, mechanism and meaning, these are not problems to be solved, but polarities to be inhabited. Tensions that generate insight precisely because they refuse easy resolution. Hold them both as you drift into unconsciousness, where behavior ceases but psyche continues its autonomous activity, where reinforcement schedules no longer apply but archetypes still speak their eternal language. The dialogue between surface and depth, between conditioning and symbol, between Skinner and Jung, continues in you, in each of us, in psychology itself as it struggles toward adequacy to its subject. May that struggle remain creative, productive, humble before the mysteries it seeks to understand. Rest now in the spaces between their visions, where perhaps something new might emerge, where behavioral science and depth psychology might one day meet, not in synthesis, but in mutual respect for different but equally valid perspectives on the inexhaustible reality of human consciousness. Welcome the dreams that come, whether you interpret them as Jung would or as Skinner would, or simply let them be, mysterious visitors from the night. Welcome the sleep that restores, the unconscious activity that continues while consciousness rests, the psyche that works whether we call it behavior or soul. And in the morning, when you wake, you will still be both shaped by contingencies and seeking meaning, behaving organism and individuating psyche, surface and depth, Skinner's subject and Jung's soul. You will still contain multitudes, still exceed all frameworks, still be beautifully, maddeningly, infinitely complex. This is the gift of their opposition, the wisdom of their dialogue. Not a resolution, but an opening. Not an answer, but a deepened question. Not closure, but continued exploration of what it means to be human in all our bewildering, magnificent multiplicity. Sleep well, dream deep, and may you wake to continued wonder at the mystery you are, the mystery we all are, the mystery that neither Skinner nor Jung nor any psychology will ever fully capture, though each contributes essential perspectives to our never-ending attempt at self-understanding.